link for you from a learning perspective, self-paced learning resources for AZ900. Now, the top link, aka.ms/learn, is a shortcut to the Microsoft Learn portal that I showed you in session 1. And in Microsoft Learn, we want, again, the Azure Fundamentals Learning Path. But also, as far as hands-on lab guide, that's where the bottom tiny URL comes into play. So I just wanted to be sure to lead off with this and make sure that you're aware. What we're doing today is understanding the core Azure services, what the Azure folks would call the 80% scenario, where 80% of their customers tend to spend their time. There are, I don't know how many services in total in the Azure ecosystem, nearly 200, I think, with more being developed literally every business day. But we're going to get into this more generally by making sure you understand Azure Resource Manager, and then we'll work with specific components inside it. Azure Resource Manager, or ARM, is the underlying engine in the Azure public cloud. And this slide introduces the resource group, which is really fundamental. You can look at a resource group in a way similar to how a folder, in your file system on your computer, if you're going to start a project, you'll put the related assets of that project in a folder for organizational purposes. If you work in IT, maybe you're going to share that folder with your users, and you'll put security on the folder so that only authorized users can get into it and get into those files. We have a similar paradigm with the resource group in Azure Resource Manager. A resource group is a container into which you can aggregate and manage related resources. The idea here is that resources in Azure that need to be managed together should be placed in the same resource group, okay? Okay, let's advance the slide here. More generally, Azure Resource Manager, or ARM, is a management layer. I like that terminology. I was going to whip out the $5 technical vocab and say that Azure Resource Manager is an application programming interface, or API. But you might be thinking ABC, XYZ, API, it's all the same to me. We can look at ARM as a management layer. This is how you interact with Azure. In particular, there's different ways to use ARM. I reviewed 2 of them with you in session 1, the Azure Portal being the main graphical way, and Azure Cloud Shell, which gives you the command line interface like Azure PowerShell. Those are different ways to interact with the Azure Resource Manager APIs. Your developers can use Visual Studio or another environment with the programming language of their choice, as long as they install what are called the Azure Software Development Kits, or SDKs. Those are all ways to tap into Azure Resource Manager. Now, let me bring up the portal in my Edge browser, and let me browse to my resource group's blade. By the way, you'll find me using that term blade a lot. A blade is simply a configuration page in Azure Resource Manager, and you can see I have a number of resource groups created. Let's create one from scratch right here in the portal. And the idea, of course, is we need to know what we're going to use the resource group for. Let's click Add. And we choose our subscription that we want the resource group to be part of. That's fine, what I have, sponsorship. We give it a name. Now you'll see in the Azure portal these little information balloons. These can be really helpful if you're not exactly sure what you're supposed to put in a field. So I want to get you into the habit of hovering over those. I'm going to call this AZ900-training. Now, the fact that the resource group has a region associated with it can be confusing to newcomers in Azure, because as you're going to see as we start to put resources into this resource group, that your resources don't have to be in the same region as the resource group itself. Normally, it is the case that you'll put everything in the same location, but they don't have to be. In fact, I may not even want East US 2. I think I'm going to choose North Central US. And you might think, Tim, why are you so confident in choosing that? Well, number one, geographically, I'm in Nashville, Tennessee, which is actually in the Southeast US, but I get the best performance in North Central. How do I know that? I'm going to give you a really cool tip. There is a project that's not coincidentally running in Azure itself, It's called Azure Speed Test V2. Let me see. Azure Speed Test 2. I want to come, here it is, Azure Speed Test 2.0. And the reason I know this is running in Azure is because the address bar says azurewebsites.net, and I happen to know by experience that that domain is owned by Microsoft. And actually, what this is doing is giving us live metrics on speeds to data centers nearest to you. And you see it kind of flip-flops for me between East US and North Central US. But I give this as a great reference for you. You can try this right now on your computer. And this is useful because it's going to tell you where you'll get the best performance. So North Central or East US is best for me. I'm going to stay with North Central. Let me come back to my portal. And in creating a resource group, that's literally all there is to it. I mean, technically we can go next and do tags. What tags are in Azure Resource Manager, they're key value pairs. And you can use these as a way, again, to put a layer of organization on your Azure resources. So you might want to, for accounting purposes, assign a cost center to different resources. So I might create one called Cost Center, and I'll call this Techno Focus. You can call them anything you want, as you can see here. And then as we go on, we can use the same tags on other Azure resources. And then you can actually, as you can expect, you can search by tags. If we do a search in the portal, there's an entirely separate blade for tags. Tags can be really useful, especially for those in your business who are responsible for maintaining the subscription, who want to generate cost reports and spending reports. You might have Azure resources that are spread across multiple resource groups, but you want to be able to aggregate them for cost management purposes. So tags can help with that. For instance, let me go into my Contoso resource group. And if I collapse the Essentials pane, I've got a whole bunch of stuff. Let me just grab this storage account. And when you're looking at an Azure resource, they normally have the same user interface with a whole bunch of settings, as you can see here. And if we search the settings list, there'll always be one for tags. And if I want to make sure that we're tracking Contoso Diag storage account along with that tag set that we created a moment ago, we can just do it right here and make sure to save the change. And then later, if our accounting people need to run a report and they need to know which assets are part of a particular tag set, we can do a report directly here in the portal by going to tags and looking at Cost Center Technofocus, excuse me, and go from there. Isn't that neat? So tags are a fundamental part of Azure Resource Manager, as are resource groups. Now that we've got that resource group, what are some things we can do with it? Well, let's go back to the resource groups blade and let's go back to AZ900 training. Like I said, the general user interface in the portal is pretty standardized. You've got your list of settings. Some of the settings are the same for every resource. They'll always have an overview, activity log, access control, tags, events. But then there'll be specific ones that are specific to that resource, you see? In fact, because so much cost reporting happens at the resource group level, there's actually a separate blade for tracking resource costs specifically, as you can see. When in doubt, though, go to the overview page, and the Essentials will give you metadata about the resource. If you need to delete it, there's normally a delete option up here. And then depending on the resource type, there'll be an informational panel down here. In the case of a resource group, it'll show you resources to display, okay? Now, let's keep going here. Let's just keep capitalizing on our momentum. And we'll talk about and work with some of the most popular Azure resources. And I'm going to teach this by doing. And like I said, I don't want you to get hung up in the clicky, because you're not going to be required on Azure Fundamentals to actually do this work. Now, if you do want to go, say, for the AZ-103 exam, that's Azure Administrator, you will have to know how to do this. In fact, the Azure Administrator exam actually has performance-based labs in it where you'll be taken into the Azure portal, and it might say, the exam might say, create a storage account with such and so properties. So be prepared for that in time, everything in time. But for our purposes, I want you to just skate really high at the high level and follow along with what I'm doing conceptually. Of course, question 0 here is, why would we want a storage account, and what the heck is a storage account? Good question. Let me just open an existing one to show you. A storage account is just a bucket to store your stuff. That's about the most generic explanation I can possibly give. Specifically, a general service storage account, as you can see here in the portal, consists of 4 services. Now, for most Azure professionals, they'll be concerned with the Blob Service. And the Blob Service is where you have different files and images and this kind of stuff. Files, media. I've created some content in here, as you can see. I created a container called media, and I actually have a ping image file in here. And I can download this file, I can back it up, I can delete it, I can do whatever I want with it. So the Blob Service is probably most familiar to people. It's where you can store any assets that are related to Azure. For instance, you might have an Azure-based virtual machine, but you want to keep its data outside the virtual machine. You can store it in a blob container. Maybe you're doing hosted web applications in Azure, but again, the web app needs to pull data elsewhere. You could store it in a storage account. A storage account is a general purpose storage mechanism in Azure. It has so many different use cases. It's highly flexible. Like I said, developers, not administrators, are going to be working with the table and queue services. These are ways for your application to quickly create and store data, and queues is used for messages, where an application might be divided into multiple components, and you can send data to and from those components using the queue service. You see what I'm saying? But like I said, for our purposes, blobs is really what we're concerned with. There's a free tool that you can download called the Azure Storage Explorer. It's a desktop app that runs on Windows, Windows, Linux, or Mac. And it allows you to just dip in and do uploads and downloads. You can get to it right from the portal, as you can see here. But it's also available. Storage Explorer is a separate download. And again, if you're going to be doing work with Azure storage accounts, I would say definitely download the Storage Explorer tool. Again, it's just as easy as doing a search for Azure Storage Explorer and hit the download page. Boom, it's a free download. Do they have a picture of it? Yes, they do. Yeah, this is what it looks like. You log into Azure with your subscription, and any storage accounts that your account has access to, they'll show up in this list. And it's just a browser where you can upload and download. It's, it's pretty user-friendly, I think. But it's nice to be able to get to Storage Explorer directly from the portal. Okay, so let's create a storage account. You've identified the need for a storage account. So how do you create it? Well, as you see, when you click Add, it takes you into this wizard type interface. And as you see across the top, these are the steps in the process. And you can move next and previous down below. If you just hit Review and Create, it will accept all defaults. But if there's fields that you have to provide, it'll say validation failed. And you'll see that Portal gives you a little, I think this is a red dot. I'm colorblind, so I have to guess, that points to where you have to provide information. So in this case, we want our subscription, and we have to select a resource group. We can put this new storage account in our new AZ900 training resource group, easy as can be. The naming convention for different Azure resources depends on the resource. Storage accounts can be a little annoying because they have to be globally unique. Think of how many customers Microsoft has in the world. Yes, the storage account has to have a name that's global across the entire world. So if I try to do something like Tim Storage and press Tab, of course it's going to be already taken. If I try to do AZ900 storage, somebody took that. You see, it's a similar kind of thing to when you're registering a domain name. Oh, cool, I want to register timwarner.com. Of course, somebody's bought that. So you've got to be a little tricky with your naming. And actually, that brings up just an important side point that I want to give you. Azure Resource naming conventions. You can bring a lot of good value to your team if you are doing work as an IT team with your company by helping them get standardized on a naming convention. It can be difficult to change some resource names later, and you want them to be descriptive, but because some of them can be so strict in terms of what they can be, you want to develop a standard. And this article that I'm clicking through gives you some good guidance on developing a global naming convention in Azure. That's time well spent, in my humble opinion. Even this one's already taken. Well, let me add a pseudo-random number after AZ900 storage, and it looks like that passed validation. The little check means that it's an acceptable value. Now, remember I said that your resources don't have to be in the same region as your resource group. We're in North Central US, but I could place the storage account in West US. I'm not going to. I'm actually going to type to filter the list and put it in North Central US because I'm just going to do that for convenience. And then again, depending on the resource, you'll want to choose the options that make the most sense for your business case. Now, we don't have the time or the scope to worry about every option here. So all I'm going to do is choose the lower cost, slower speed, that's standard performance. The account type, I'm going to leave it general purpose V2. And redundancy or replication is how many copies of the storage account you want Microsoft to make. I'm going to choose the least expensive option, which is called LRS. And as far as how to learn about this, if you do want to get into the weeds and understand more about performance and account type, check the docs. You can do it directly in the portal here by looking up, say, storage account, and look over here. Azure Storage Account Overview. You can click out and it takes you to a beautifully written docs article. Let me zoom in. That was last updated in this case on June the 6th. Now that's not too long ago. Remember I told you that the docs articles are open source and these are the contributors over here. And the pencil icon means that you can submit changes to the document yourself. All of the Azure docs are stored in GitHub. So I'm just mentioning this stuff. Yes, I'm throwing a lot at you, but yes, I have confidence in you. And yes, you can review this training as much as you want. And yes, I believe I'm doing you a service by giving you as much action as possible per unit time. How's that? We're going to choose the hot access tier, which is the default. That means that Microsoft is expecting you to interact with your files regularly instead of them being archival. Let's go to next. There's some more options that are specific to the storage account. I'm going to leave those at the default. Tags, again, let's say that we want this to be part of our cost center. So we'll wait for the list to show up and then we'll choose cost center Technofocus. You can have more than one tag per resource, as you can see here. Let's next go to review and create. The review step is crucial, and the fact that it validated is important. Specifically, what that means is Azure is taking all of your choices and running them against Azure Resource Manager to make sure that they're compatible. So you can't proceed actually until validation is passed. We'll click Create now. And we can follow the progress of the deployment here in this view if we want to. But we can also go ahead and do other work. We don't have to wait for that deployment to complete. Remember in Azure, the principles of cloud computing that I shared with you in session 1? We've got massive cloud scale, and we can do work in parallel. So we don't have that serial idea where we have to wait for this task to complete before we can move on. Now, of course, we would have to wait for this task to complete before we can work with the storage account. But if we wanted to deploy, say, a virtual machine, we can just do that immediately. Now up here, notice that the bell icon is showing an animation. If we open the notification bell, it shows us here that the deployment's in progress. And if we want to go back to its detail view, we can click this link and it takes us back here. I'm going to collapse this sidebar. We don't need to worry about that. And it's going to show us eventually, I'm surprised it hasn't shown anything yet, what it's doing under the hood. And this is a pretty simple operation. It just needs to create a single storage account. You may be doing a much more robust deployment that has a dozen or more steps, but each of these steps that Azure does, Microsoft tells you about. That's what this operations detail is. So we can click, whoop, it finished before I could complete it. Let me bring it back here. Operation details, and it'll give you some metadata about how long it worked on a particular step and exactly what it did. This is useful because remember, in cloud computing, we're never ever going to be able to go to the data center where this storage account lives. We're never going to see the server that it lives on. We're never going to see the hard disks that it's on. All of that is in the cloud. You know, the metaphor of the cloud is in fact useful because just like when you're looking up at the sky, if it's a cloudy day, there may be an airplane on the other side of those clouds, but you won't know. Maybe you'll hear the sound, I know, but you won't see the airplane. It's abstracted away from you. Similarly, we're never going to get our hands on the underlying infrastructure. So we have to rely on the details that Microsoft gives us. So it's useful that they do that here, okay? Another thing you should know in the name of Azure Resource Manager, again, don't worry about the details. If you get further in Azure certification, you absolutely will need to know those details. But I want you to know that you can always go back and look at what's happened. Maybe, for instance, you've been hired as a consultant and a business is having trouble with a storage account that they created, let's say, or maybe they want to learn how they can automate creating a storage account. Maybe they need to create 100 storage accounts and they don't want to have to clicky through the Azure portal 100 times, you see. Check this out. This is pretty cool. On the resource groups blade, we can go into the resource group where we know that storage account exists. Let me collapse my essentials pane. Here it is right here, as a matter of fact. We can look through the settings list. Down under settings, we've got deployments. Microsoft tracks every single operation that you do in your subscription. So that means that if you have a troublesome employee who's trying to sneak and do things off on the side and he or she thinks that they're not going to be detected, they are gravely mistaken. So this is showing a record of every deployment into this resource group. We can see there's only been one, and it's deploying a storage account. It happened on this date and time. It took this length of time, and then if we go to related events, this tells us who initiated it. You see what I mean? So Azure Resource Manager is always watching. If you're familiar with George Orwell's 1984, I wouldn't call Azure Resource Manager Big Brother, but it's tracking everything for sure. Now let me step back. You see it navigationally? We've got two things actually I want to show you. Let me bring out the related events blade again. We've got this horizontal scroll bar. So when you click something, it's not like you're replacing the screen with something else. You're extending it. So I can scroll all the way back to the left and we can see here's our resource groups. Here we have our AZ900 resource group. And I clicked related events and now we're brought into the activity log. Each of these screens is called a blade. The entire sequence here is, I think Microsoft might still call it a journey. I know to me it's a little corny, a little cliche, but anyway, that's how it works. And you can either scroll back and forth using the horizontal scroll bar, or you can use up here what I call the breadcrumb navigation trail. The metaphor there is you can leave a trail of breadcrumbs. We had to do that in my family just the other day. Our 9-year-old daughter has a hamster named Queso. Queso got loose. Well, how did we get Queso back into her cage? We put a little trail of pellets back to her cage, and it worked. Within a half hour, she was back in her cage. Let's step back to deployments, and then let's step back one more time into resource groups. And let's go into one that I've had for a while. Contoso is one that I've been using for a while. And let me filter the settings list for deployments. And in this case, look here, wow, this is a long list of things that I've done in this resource group, and it's in reverse chronological order. So if we scroll down, in April of this year, I created a VM, and if you click the details, you can get a record of exactly what happened when, and then check this out. The fact that all of these deployments are templated means that we can redeploy directly from here. So if I think to myself, you know that VM1 I created back in April, I want to quickly create another VM that has the same properties. You can do that here because it's all templated. Of course, we would want to change some of the properties. It looks like there's a validation error here that I might need to correct. And of course, I'll want to give it a new name and that kind of stuff. But I just want to get you thinking here, because every operation in Azure is templated, that gives you the possibility to do automation. And automation feeds into a lot of buzzwords that you may be familiar with, like DevOps would be one, and continuous integration, continuous deployment would be another one, this kind of stuff. Okay, another, besides the storage account, there's the virtual machine. Oh, just for completeness sake, let's go back to AZ900 training and back to its resource list and go into that storage account just to quickly show you how to interact with it. We can go into Storage Explorer here directly in the portal. And let's say we wanted a place to store our PowerShell scripts to share with our team. If we right-click Blob Containers, we can create a new container, and I'll call this PowerShell Scripts. I'll leave the security at the default, which means you have to be given access in order to access this stuff. And I'll click Upload, and we can browse our local computer to find a PowerShell script. I'm not sure exactly where I can go to find one here. Let me do a search for star.ps1 in Windows Explorer. Yeah, I'll just grab a random PS1 script file and bring it in. You see what I mean? It should be pretty intuitive if you've used Dropbox or OneDrive or whatever the case may be. It's very much a similar kind of situation, only it's Azure specific. Okay, so there's our general purpose storage account. We can use that, and we will use that as we go forward with our training. In my consulting work, virtual machines really form the most familiar resource to most people in IT because they're accustomed to running virtual machines on premises. By the way, just a quick sanity check. The term is not on premise. It disappoints me when I see, even sometimes in Microsoft's own literature, a reference to on-premise infrastructure. Please don't make that mistake, especially if you're just getting into IT. You don't want to go to an IT technical job interview and refer to on-premise. A premise is an idea. So on-premise makes no sense. What are you talking about on-premise infrastructure? Are you just imagining it? A premises is a location. So therefore, on-premises infrastructure means infrastructure that's on our business campus. Anyway, get off your soapbox, Tim. Here we have the virtual machines blade, and I have a couple of these guys running. How do we interact with a virtual machine that's running in Azure? Well, in the portal, we can just click it. As long as it's running, we can connect to it, at least in theory. Notice that if it were stopped, we could start it. We could stop it if we want to stop it. We can restart it if it's having trouble and we can't get into it. Capture means you can take an image of the virtual machine and then use that image to deploy n number of VMs in the future. You can delete. So those are pretty intuitive. How do we know who can connect and who can perform these operations? We'll do security, I think, in session 4, but that's the access control. This is really an important aspect of Azure because, like I told you in session 1, any business is going to be a little concerned, probably more than a little concerned, about the security of their environment. It's like, okay, we're going to put a database server on a VM running in Azure. If somebody were to break into that VM, our business would be done. We'd go out of business within a day. So this is super important stuff. And the idea with Azure is that you've got what's called role-based access control, where the idea is you want least privilege resource access. You certainly don't want Joe or Jane end user able to come in here and connect to a virtual machine. You don't even want necessarily your entire IT department to connect. Only those who should have access should have access. Assuming that Tim at timwinfo does have access, we can go to connect. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that with the browser. If I hit connect here, it's going to give us some instructions. RDP stands for Remote Desktop Protocol. That's the main way to connect to a Windows-based virtual machine. SSH stands for Secure Shell, and that's the main way to connect to a Linux virtual machine. So this, I happen to know, is a Windows VM. How do I know? We can see right here on the overview page, it tells us the operating system. Note that we also tells us the size. One of the coolest things I think about running virtual machines in Azure is that if you feel the VM is too big or too small, in other words, it has too much or too little RAM or CPU power, with a couple clicks of the mouse, you can resize it. That's crazy. If you're accustomed to on-prem, you buy a server and maybe for 4 months it's really cutting edge and it's fast, but within 1.5 years people are complaining and you're like, this server is too slow. Well, we've got to request a hardware upgrade, or we've got to wait till the end of this lease cycle. Doesn't work like that with cloud VMs. Of course, you're going to pay more for a larger VM, but you've got that ability to resize on demand. We'll talk about pricing and all that stuff in session 4, by the way. Let's go back to connect. And like I said, depending upon how you're connecting, there'll be instructions. I have an additional layer of security on the VM called just in time. That locks the RDP connection unless you request access. This is a nice extra layer of protection, because there are bad actors in the world who scan the Microsoft Azure public IP address ranges looking to break in via RDP, or maybe to a much lesser degree SSH, to try to compromise a server. Just understand that that is the case. People will try to break into your VM, so it's important that you take these security steps. So I'm going to request access. It normally takes 30 seconds to a minute for this to go through. And what's going to happen with just-in-time access policy is that you get a time-limited window where access is approved on that protocol and on that port. So I'm going to download the connection file. It comes down to my local workstation. Let me resize my browser so I can get to it and bring it out onto my desktop. I'll wait a few more seconds because, like I said, it normally takes up to a minute for that just-in-time access to kick in. Hang on a second. It gives me a good chance to take a swig of coffee. There we are. So I'll double left click my VM2 connection. And hopefully, there we go. We get some connection requests here that I'll accept. We'll be asked to authenticate. So you have to have an account on the virtual machine, which I do, because I created it. I'll provide my username and password. Well, that's not good. What do you mean it didn't work? Tim, let me try this. Uh-oh. Let me try one more time. How about I try Pat? I think I have an administrative user named Pat on that box. Oh, come on, man. Anyway, what's supposed to happen is it will open up a remote desktop connection, and in a window, you'll see a desktop environment. If you've never used RDP, if you've used RDP and you've used remote desktop, you're thinking, Tim, keep going, I understand, got it. But if not, I just want you to understand, just to give you some context, what you're seeing right here on this screen is a VM RDP session. So this is what we would see on VM2 if I remembered my password. If you see what I'm pointing to, I don't know if you can see this banner. It's saying vm1tlw.eastus2.cloudapp.azure.com. That's the full address of my VM1 VM. So I'm teaching. Let me come back to the portal here. I'm actually teaching from VM1 that you see right here. So if I stop VM1, I'm going to lose my screen share. So we don't want to do that. Reminds me of the movie Inception, if you've ever seen that. A dream inside a dream inside a dream inside a dream. All right, what other kind of trouble can we get in here as we're learning about VMs? Let's come back to our exam objectives because I'm always keeping in mind our skills measured. Scale sets, app service functions, networks. Okay, right. So I think what we'll do next is take a look at networking. Now, networking can and is an entirely separate course. I work pretty closely with the Azure product groups in my day job and as my MVP participation. And they've told me that the number one category of their support requests is in networking. And I think the reason for that is because Ethernet and TCP/IP is an entire career path in itself. And it represents a significant learning curve for just about anybody in IT. So in order to master Azure networking means that you have to master Ethernet and TCP/IP and subnetting and protocols and ports and all of that good stuff. And then on top of that, you have to apply that into Azure. So you have to know about virtual machines and network interfaces. You have to know about network security groups. I mean, we can get really into the weeds really quickly here. But the good news, and I want you to take comfort in this, is that you're not going to be asked about the details on Azure fundamentals. Instead, here's what I want you to know about networking. In Azure networking with your virtual machines, you put your virtual machines together in what's called a virtual network. I'm going to show you this, showing you a picture. You know that old saw, a picture is worth 1,000 words? If you point your browser to, hopefully the URL still works, I'll be darned, I wonder why that didn't work. I'm gonna have to fix that. Anyway, I wanna take you to a website that Microsoft put together called the Azure Architecture Center. So just do a search for Azure Architecture Center, and you might be thinking, Tim, I'm studying Azure fundamentals. I'm not an architect. Well, you don't have to be. What they have here and what we're concerned with are these, not technologies. Where the heck are they? Technologies. VM workloads. Yeah, it looks like Microsoft reorganized this, unfortunately. They have a library of diagrams, okay? That's what I'm trying to get in a long-winded way. So you go to Azure Architecture. It looks like now you drill under Technologies, and then I suggest you go under VM workloads. And then under there, there's a list of reference architectures. Let's go to Windows VM deployment. And let me right-click and open this diagram in another tab to make it easier for us to look at. And let's go one step further and to make this full screen. Okay, so what we have in a nutshell with your VMs is that you place them on an Azure resource called a virtual network. That's where my mouse is outlining right here. That's the virtual network. And the idea of a virtual network, it's a very strong security boundary and communications boundary. So you would put your VMs that all relate to the same application or service on the same VNet, as it's sometimes called. And all your VMs within a VNet can see each other and interact, but if you have more than one VNet, there's no connection by default. Of course, you can override that, but so you want to be careful how you're planning your VNets. So I just want you to think that VNet is where you organize your VMs into. Your virtual machine connects to the network via a network interface card or a NIC. Now, this is all in software. If you're fortunate enough to have hardware experience, and being an IT veteran, I sometimes get a little curmudgeonly. When I meet somebody new to IT, I say, please do yourself a favor, build a computer, work with physical computing to some degree. Don't just go directly to the cloud. I think it's helpful to be able to visualize networking from a physical standpoint. But in Azure, it's a software network interface, and then you use IP addresses to connect. And there's two types of IP addresses. There's private IPs that stay within the virtual network, and then optionally there's public IPs where you can go out onto the internet. And that's where some real danger can come in. Let me come out of full screen mode here and come back to the portal. It looks like VM2 does have a public IP. You want to be careful with those because public IPs mean that you're exposing the virtual machine directly to the internet. And you may have a legitimate use case where you need to do that. Maybe you're hosting a customer-facing web application. So in that case, it does need to go directly out onto the internet. But as a matter of practice, it's not a good idea because it represents a way for an attacker to reach your VM. Speaking of attackers, the network security group, or the NSG, is essentially a firewall, if you're familiar with that. The idea here is you're creating a list of connections that are allowed into the VM, and anything else should be restricted. That's why at the bottom of the list here, see this rule that says deny all inbound? So this means a connection into VM2 from either within the virtual network or from the internet. If it doesn't match one of these allow rules, it's going to get picked up by this catch-all deny, okay? So again, to sum up, your virtual machine connects to the virtual network through what's called a network interface. And the network interface has a private IP that allows connectivity within the virtual network, and optionally a public IP that allows connection to the internet. And then you use network security groups to secure connections into that network interface, all right? That's about as condensed as a way as I can possibly summarize networking. Pretty crazy to do that. But anyway, in terms of a hybrid cloud, let me see if I can find a reference article for that. Hybrid networking. I wish Microsoft didn't change this, but whatever. Let me zoom out so we can see this. Okay, hybrid, remember from session 1, means that we're extending our on-premises network into Azure. So in this diagram in the upper left corner, this is your on-premises physical network, and you probably have a router that connects you out to the internet. Okay, that's what this gateway signifies. You can create what's called a virtual private network, or a VPN, into an Azure virtual network. You do that by deploying a VPN gateway in Azure, and there's a lot of other work that you have to do to get this running, but just again, from the fundamental standpoint, this virtual private network means that you've got a secure connection between your on-premises network and your Azure virtual network over the public internet, which I think you and I would agree is a very unsecure medium. And once you've done this, it unlocks all sorts of cool possibilities. Like you can join your virtual machines in Azure to your local Active Directory domain. By contrast, you can take your on-premises servers and manage them in Azure. So a hybrid network using a VPN can be a really compelling way. It's, in my experience, the most popular way that businesses work with Azure, because they almost always want to leverage what they've got going on-prem. Now, there's another whole discussion we could have that I'll just mention parenthetically, and that is businesses that want to eventually get rid of their on-premises network and run everything in Azure Virtual Networks and Azure Platform Services. You don't need a VPN for that. There's other ways to get that particular job done. Normally, the VPN option is where you're going to do a true hybrid cloud, where you're doing some infrastructure on-prem, some in Azure. Now, this diagram integrates a fly into the proverbial ointment. You see this reference to Azure Stack. I'm quite sure that Azure Stack isn't in the Azure Fundamentals exam, but I want to mention it very briefly. Azure Stack is a portable version of the Azure Public Cloud. It's literally a rack of hardware servers that you buy or rent and put in your on-premises environment. Or you could, the use case for Azure Stack is that you might have remote environments. Maybe you're a shipping company and you want to have an Azure Stack on your ship that may be way out in the middle of the ocean where it can't get an internet connection, let's say. You can still take advantage of all of Azure's goodness in terms of platform as a service and infrastructure as a service in a local way, in a private cloud way. So Azure Stack allows you to take the Azure Public Cloud in a portable way and then optionally link it to an on-premises network on one side and/or to Azure Virtual Networks and the Azure Public Cloud. All righty? Just wanted to mention that in passing as we're going by. Back to our skills measured. Databases and data, sure. Okay, so let's come back to home plate here and discuss that a little bit. To review what we've been doing so far touring these resources, we started with a storage account, which is really nice general purpose storage for your applications and services. I showed you existing virtual machines and some of the things that we can do to connect to the VM. I described its networking a little bit. Just for grins, we can go through and create a VM. Again, I'm going to go over this from a really schematic level. We don't have to get hung up in all the details based for Azure fundamentals. If you do want to do Azure Administrator or Azure Architect, you will be required to do things like creating a virtual machine in the portal. So in that case, you will have to know how to do it, but we don't. So we're going to choose our subscription and we'll put the VM in our AZ900 training resource group. I'll call this VM3 in keeping with what we've been doing thus far. Actually, since I'm using a different resource group, I can use a different naming convention. I'll call this AZ900 VM1. How's that? And again, I'll filter the list to put it in North Central. Remember about the infrastructure redundancy, availability zones. We're not going to mess with that. But what we are going to mess with is image. Image is what kind of VM are you going to deploy? This list gives you the most common options. You've got several versions of Windows Server. You also have different distributions of Linux to choose from. If you click Browse All Public and Private Images, you go into, remember this is the Azure Marketplace, where you might choose an image that already has an application installed. Maybe you want to deploy a SharePoint farm. Looks like there's different options. So this is going to save you some time because it's going to give you a VM that not only has the base OS installed, but also has a product installed on top of it. You see what I mean? So these are where you're choosing templates in the Azure Marketplace. But what if you have on-premises VMs that you want to use as a template? I want you to know that that entire life cycle is supported in Azure. The high-level way to describe it is this. Let's say you've got an on-premises web server that you want to take an image snapshot of, copy it into Azure, and then use it as a template. So what you would do is you'd prepare the image on premises, and you can do that in a number of ways. It's beyond our scope to worry about how. And then you could use, for instance, that Azure Storage Explorer program that we talked about a little bit earlier today. Remember, I think I've got it installed on this system, actually, Storage Explorer. Yeah, right here. I'll just open it and try to keep it in the background in case we need it. But you would then copy your virtual machine image from your on-premises environment into, say, the storage account, the Blob service that we created. And then once you've done that, you can create an Azure VM image. And then look here, you can go over to My Items, and any images that you've created will show up in this list. So I just want to kind of underline the point that when you create a VM in Azure, it can be based on an Azure Marketplace image or an image that your team has created. I'm going to choose, in this example, Windows Server 2019. Remember I mentioned the fact that cloud scale means we can resize a virtual machine? Look here. We can choose an initial size for the VM. And there's a huge library of sizes here. Notice that they all have metrics, number of virtual processors, how much RAM, how many additional data disks you can add, how fast the storage is. That's what IOP stands for. It stands for input-output operations per second. And you can choose different sizes. I'm just going to grab B1 LS off the top here, but you would spend time figuring out the best size for your use case, and you see an estimated cost per month here. I'm going to select the size. Yes, you can always change the size later. We create an initial administrator account that has to have a strong password. Notice that it gives you guidance here as you type in terms of things like password complexity and all that kind of stuff. And my strong password. It's asking here about public IP addresses, I'm going to say no, thank you. You can get up to a 50% discount on your runtime costs if you already have licenses for your on-premises environment. I'm going to specify that and click Next. What kind of storage for the hard disks, the virtual hard disks? I'm going to choose the cheaper option, standard HDD. The premium SSD and standard SSD use no moving parts because it's flash storage, solid state, but I'm going to choose inexpensive storage. We won't need any additional data disks. The networking page deals with what virtual network do you want, and if you don't have one handy, I do, but if you don't have one handy, notice that the wizard here will create one for us. Do you want to do a network security group? And if so, how much control do you want over it? I'll just do basic. No public IP address. There's other ways to connect to it if that's the case. Management, what do we want in here? Azure Security Center, what kind of diagnostics do we want to store? Do we want Azure to track diagnostic info? And if so, you have to put it in a storage account. Well, guess what? We created a storage account today. So why don't we use the storage account we already created to store virtual machine diagnostics information? I think that's about it. Let me go to Review and Create to accept all the other defaults. Hopefully the validation passes and we could submit that deployment. Okay, we'll revisit this VM in session 3 and 4, but I want to keep going here because that's infrastructure as a service. Azure App Service is the mainline platform as a service offering, and there's a number of products that fit within this. Let's go to Add and I'll show you what I mean. Again, we have resource group and subscription. That's always the case. What's your web app name? I'll try to add some globally unique info because it has to be a globally unique name. How are you publishing it? What operating system will the underlying virtual machine have? This kind of stuff. How much compute do you want under the website? That's what an app service plan is. And notice it's giving you similar metrics to what you're expecting with virtual machines. If we click size, it looks different, but you're doing the same basic thing that we did for infrastructure as a service. We're choosing a level of compute power that we want for our hosted web application. Let's go to monitoring. I'll just leave that at the default. Let's go to Review and Create. Looks like we've got a validation error on the Basics tab. I must have forgot to specify something. Oh, a runtime stack. Yeah, so this would simply be what kind of application are you running? And again, in the name of new Microsoft, notice that you've got Java and Node and Python. You go far beyond the Microsoft stack. That said, I'm going to choose the Microsoft ASP.NET 4.7 stack. Okay, hopefully that'll take just a moment to finish. But the great beauty here that you're going to see is just with a few clicks of the mouse, we have a hosted web application that your developers can immediately get to work on. And you don't have to worry about the underlying environment, backups. I mean, you can have the web app automatically back up. That's one of the things you can do with it. But all the things that you normally have to do with your virtual machines, like adjust the firewall and make sure that you're patching it and all of that kind of maintenance, you don't have to worry about with App Service, because with Platform as a Service, you can focus on your code and your application and let Microsoft take care of all of the underlying infrastructure. That same thing goes with databases. If you've worked with SQL Server, which is Microsoft's main on-premises relational database, we've got Azure SQL Database. Let's just quickly create one of these. Again, we'll put it in AZ900 training, and I'm going to be very quick here. You have to create a new virtual server to host the database. I'll call this AZ900 8, see if that's unique. I'll create a login for the database server with a strong password. Hopefully I'll type it correctly twice. Its location, I'll make sure that it's in the same location. I do want Azure Services to be able to access the server. Here's again, compute, because with Platform as a Service, you still have virtual machines running under the hood, but they've been abstracted away. You can choose the size, but you don't have to worry about the registry or any of that kind of stuff. I'm going to go to the pricing tiers and choose standard. I think this will work. Again, I'm going very fast intentionally because we don't need to worry about the details for the fundamentals. I want to show you what this looks like after it's been created so you can get a really good tangible feel of platform as a service. So we get an estimated cost per month. Now, $15 US dollars for this. I would challenge any business to say that their on-premises maintenance of a SQL database is any cheaper than that. You see what I'm saying? So, oh, the database name, sure. I'll call this AZ900DB. Review and create. I'm trying to submit this deployment as quickly as I can here. In the interest of time, it looks like we've got about 6 minutes left. There's other database platforms in Azure. If you're familiar with structured query language or SQL, that's the relational model with traditional database tables and relationships. As far as NoSQL, if you're familiar with non-relational databases, the mainline product you should be aware of there is called Cosmos DB. And this is a non-relational multi-model database system. So again, we're going to quickly deploy an instance of this. I'll call the account AZ900 Cosmos. Hopefully that's unique. And I said multi-model. Without getting into the weeds, there's a number of different ways that NoSQL data stores work. You might have wide column, you might have document, you might have graph. Well, Cosmos supports 5 different models. I like Core, which is a document storage model, because it uses a structured query language like syntax. So it should be really useful for people who already know the structured query language like I do. So if I, again, place it in my appropriate region, you can this is something else with platform as a service. You can geo-distribute your databases and replicate them across multiple regions with just a couple mouse clicks. In other words, we can make this Cosmos DB account geographically redundant just by clicking the mouse. Of course, that's going to have an impact on pricing. But when you think about on-premises, how much would it cost you to take your on-premises database and put it in multiple data centers around the world? I'll wait. You see what I'm saying? And the fact that when you're hosting your database in the cloud, you can geo-replicate it with a click of the mouse, it's unbelievable. That's really, to me, shows the great, huge power of cloud scale. It really does. Okay, so I'm popping all these deployments out one after the other because I just want to keep us on track and show you as much as possible. Let's see, AI, serverless, there's all these other categories of products that we can look at. All of these are platform as a service offerings. Let me zoom in, let's quickly inspect the list. Internet of Things refers to any device that has a network interface. It could be sensors on your shop floor or, thermostats, anything like that. You've got products in Azure that allow you to centrally manage and control IoT devices. We've got big data and analytics. If you're familiar with the Hadoop ecosystem, that's what HD Insight is. You've got the concept of the data lake. You've got storage account actually can be used for data lake storage. A data lake is where you've got a whole bunch of unprocessed data and you haven't yet determined what you want to do with it. If you're familiar with artificial intelligence and machine learning, there's an entire platform there. There's the Azure Machine Learning Service, the Machine Learning Studio, which is the graphical front end to that. Serverless is a pretty popular term nowadays. Azure Functions, Logic Apps, AppGrid, those are products that support serverless computing. Now that's really the ultimate of hosted code. In other words, on one end, you've got IaaS with virtual machines, which you have to fully control the whole environment. You've got platform as a service like Azure SQL Database and the hosted web apps where it's kind of half and half. And then you've got serverless like Azure Functions where it's literally you're just uploading code into Azure and then Azure runs the code on a schedule or based on a trigger or something like that. So anyway, let's go to App Service because before we quit today, I want to show you this platform as a service business. So here we've got that new web app that we've created. How do we actually work with it? Well, number one, we can download what's called the publish profile. And this means our developers can fire up your development tool like Visual Studio, for instance. I might as well start that just in case we need it later. Takes forever to start on this virtual machine though. And we can open up this publish settings file to make a connection to this website. So the bottom line is your developers can make a connection to this app service from their desktop, and they can publish code directly up into it. It's a hosting environment, right? And as you see, we've got FTP. They can put their code in here via FTP, or there's an entire deployment section here, deployment center, where you can integrate the app service into Azure Repos, which is Azure's own code repository system. You can store the code in a private or public GitHub repository. There's support for third parties like Bitbucket. So you've got lots of ability here for code management. I shouldn't have clicked out of there. You've got the ability to configure scaling, both scaling up and down. That's where you make the underlying VMs bigger or smaller. Or you can scale out. You can say, you know what, this app service is behaving a little sluggish. I think it's getting hit too hard. What if we have 2 instances, or what if we have 10 instances that are all working in parallel? So if I hit 2 and click save, Azure is duplicating this for me. And I don't have to do any VM deployment. I don't have to do any copying and tweaking. It's just transparently going to advertise the single web application, but it will scale horizontally for you. Here's the URL, by the way. It's the az900tw704.azurewebsites.net. Let me click out to it and see. Yeah, so this is just a placeholder page that Microsoft gives, but this site is live on the internet right now. And yes, you can add your own DNS name and so on. So, all right, so it's time for us to quickly wrap up. So let's do a review question and then we'll call it finished. You need to create a virtual machine using your Mac computer. Which of the following tools can you use? This is an interesting question. Everything we've talked, well, I'm just going to take that back. I've mentioned that Azure is a friendly environment for other products besides Microsoft products. So what do you think? Azure PowerShell, Azure Portal, Azure CLI, Azure Mobile App. In session 1, I told you about A, B, and D. Azure CLI is simply another free download that you can use to get command line access to Azure. So in this case, from your Mac computer, you can use everything but the mobile app, because the mobile apps are for mobile devices, iOS and Android in particular. What is the minimum number of VMs required? This gets into the weed. I don't like this question because you're not going to be asked necessarily this level of depth on fundamentals, but this is saying what's the minimum number you need to meet a certain high availability service level agreement. And this does speak to what I said at the beginning, where you need to use availability zones with your VMs in order to place them in different data centers and qualify for super high service level agreements. Here again is the link to the Azure Fundamentals Microsoft Learn, that's AKA MS Learn, and also note the hands-on lab guide tiny URL down at the bottom. What we're going to do in session 3 is security, privacy, compliance, and trust. Thanks for joining. I hope I didn't overwhelm you too much, and I'll see you in session 3. Thanks.